Vladimir Lenin.
Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Vladimir Lenin.
Lenin was born in the Russian Empire in the town of Simbirsk on April 22nd, 1870, and baptized several days later. He was one of 8 children, having 2 older siblings, including Alexander. Lenin's father, Ilya, was a devout member of the Russian Orthodox Church and baptized his children into it. Lenin's father was from a family of serfs. Despite his lower-class background, he had risen to middle-class status, studying physics and mathematics at the Kazan Imperial University before finally teaching at the Penza Institute for Nobility. In January 1886, when Lenin was 16, his father died of a brain hemorrhage. Subsequently, his behavior became erratic and confrontational as he renounced his belief in God. At the time, Lenin's elder brother, Alexander, whom he affectionately knew as Sasha, studied at the St. Petersburg University. He was involved in political agitation against the absolute monarchy of Tsar Alexander III. Alexander studied the writings of anti-government writings and organized protests. He joined a revolutionary cell bent on assassinating the Tsar and was selected to construct a bomb. Before the attack could take place, however, the conspirators were arrested and tried, and in May of 1887, Alexander Ulyanov was executed by hanging. The death of Alexander made Lenin furious, and he promised to get revenge for his brother's death. Despite the emotional trauma of his father's and brother's deaths, Lenin continued studying and graduated with a gold medal for exceptional performance and decided to study law at the Kazan University. In 1889, the Ulyanov family moved to the city of Samara, where Lenin joined Alexei Sklyrenko's socialist discussion circle. There, Lenin fully embraced Marxism and produced a Russian-language translation of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels' 1848 political pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto. Lenin remained in Samara for several years, working first as a legal assistant for a regional court, then for a local lawyer. He devoted much of his time to radical politics, remaining active in Sklyrenko's group and formulating ideas about how Marxism applied to Russia. Inspired by Georgy Plekhanov's work, Lenin collected data on Russian society, using it to support a Marxist interpretation of societal development and counter claims of the agrarian socialist movement. He wrote a paper on peasant economics, and it was rejected by the liberal journal Russian Thought. In late 1893, Lenin moved to St. Petersburg. There, he publicly championed Marxism within social movements, and he encouraged the founding of revolutionary cells in Russian industrial centers. By late 1894, he was leading a Marxist workers' circle and meticulously covering his tracks, knowing that police spies tried to infiltrate the movement. He then traveled around Europe, speaking with other fellow Marxists, and eventually returned to Russia with a stash of illegal revolutionary publications. He traveled to various cities distributing literature to striking workers, while involved in producing a news sheet. He was among 40 activists arrested in St. Petersburg and charged with sedition. Lenin denied all charges against him but remained in prison for a year before being sentenced. He spent this time theorizing and writing. In his work, he noted the rise of industrial capitalism in Russia. From his Marxist perspective, Lenin argued that this Russian proletariat would develop class consciousness, which would in turn lead them to violently overthrow Tsarism, the aristocracy, and the bourgeoisie, and to establish a proletariat state in which the working class would have political power. February of 1897, he was sentenced without trial to 3 years in exile in eastern Siberia. Keeping up with developments in German Marxism, Lenin remained devoted to violent revolution. He also finished the book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, which criticized the agrarian socialists and promoted a Marxist analysis of Russian economic development. After his exile in 1900, Lenin was now part of a new part of the Russian Marxist Party, now calling itself the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. He then traveled around Europe. He began to publish a Marxist newspaper called the Iskra. Lenin later had a major argument with another leader of the party, Julius Martov, which divided the party in two. Lenin wanted to establish socialism right away, rather than establishing capitalism at first, then making the transition to socialism. Martov disagreed. He wanted to cling to the classical Marxist idea that in order to achieve socialism, you must go through capitalism. People who agreed with Martov were called Mensheviks. People who agreed with Lenin were called the Bolsheviks. After January 1905 and the Bloody Sunday massacre of protests in St. Petersburg, sparked from a civil unrest known as the Revolution of 1905. According to Lenin, on the Revolution of 1905, the uprising has begun, rivers of blood are flowing, the civil war for freedom is blazing. Moscow in the south, Caucasus in Poland are ready to join the proletariat of St. Petersburg. The slogan of the workers has become death or freedom. In June 1907, a group of Bolsheviks acting under the leadership of Joseph Stalin committed an armed robbery of the state bank in Georgia. Russia entered World War I in August of 1914 in support of the Serbs and their French and British allies. Militarily, Imperial Russia was no match for modern, industrialized Germany. Lenin advocated for Russian defeat in World War I, arguing that it would accelerate the political revolution that he desired. Hoping that Lenin could destabilize their foe, the Germans arranged for Lenin and other Russian revolutionaries to return to Russia. When Lenin returned home to Russia in April of 1917, the Russian Revolution was already underway. Strikes were going on over food shortages earlier in the year, forcing the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, ending centuries of imperial rule. Russia then came under the command of a new government which opposed violent social reform and continued Russian involvement in World War I. Lenin began plotting an overthrow of this new government. To Lenin, the government was a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. He advocated instead for a direct rule by the workers and peasants and a dictatorship of the proletariat. By fall of 1917, in the November Revolution, Russians had become even more wary. Peasants, workers, and soldiers demanded immediate change. Lenin, aware of the leadership vacuum plaguing Russia, decides to finally seize power. He secretly organizes a volunteer paramilitary force called the Red Guards, and on November 7th and 8th, 1917, the Red Guards captured provisional government buildings in a bloodless coup d'etat. The Bolsheviks seized power of the government and proclaimed Soviet rule, making Lenin leader of the world's first communist state. The Bolshevik Revolution plunged Russia into a 3-year civil war. The Red Army, backed by Lenin's newly formed Communist Party, fought the White Army, supporters of capitalism and democratic socialism. After an assassination attempt, Lenin's secret police instituted a period known as the Red Terror, a campaign of mass executions against any socialists who weren't loyal to Lenin's Communist Party. By some estimates, the secret police may have executed as many as 100,000 or so class enemies during the Red Terror between September and October of 1918. Lenin's Red Army eventually won Russia's civil war in 1922. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formed. Lenin was the first head of the USSR, but by that time, his health was deteriorating. Between 1922 and his death in 2012, Lenin suffered a series of strokes which compromised his ability to govern. His absence later paved the way for Joseph Stalin, the Communist Party's new general secretary, to begin consolidating power. Lenin resented Stalin's growing political power as he saw his ascendancy as a threat to the USSR.